ask you if any of you have had one of those cringeworthy moments when you are so embarrassed for another person who's done something so foolish that you just cringe to look at what they're doing, and you just want to get out of there, but there's no way to do it. And that poor person's making a fool of themselves. Has anybody ever had that kind of experience? Yeah. Heads shaking up and down. Well, I think that when that happens, I would suggest that when we cringe, that we are thinking on some level, there but for the grace of God go I. We suspect that, maybe we're capable of being that foolish ourselves. In fact, we probably have been, and we don't even want to think about it. Subconsciously, we realize that we're all the same. All people are the same. But on a conscious level, we reject that idea because we want to feel better than someone, even if we know that we aren't. So with that background, consider Michal, Saul's youngest daughter. So she's the youngest daughter of the king of Israel before David. And she's now David's wife. In fact, at the time of this story, she's one of several wives of David, but she was the first. Now David, in the story today, is bringing the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, to Jerusalem in order to consolidate the two kingdoms, Judah and Israel, into one kingdom under his crown, his rule. And all of Jerusalem and David's party are celebrating, and David, in a religious ecstasy, is dancing before the Lord with all his might. And what does Michal do? She despises him in her heart. Now, note here, David is wearing a linen ephod. Now, the linen ephod, or an ephod, was somewhat less modest than the one pictured on your bulletin. It was a small apron used on ceremonial occasions, along with other garments. So, essentially, David is dancing naked before God. Which is why Michal says in a later verse, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering, more literally, stripping himself before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly strip himself. She is not pleased. Michal, I think, is saying to herself, my father wouldn't have done that. He was a real king. He at least had a sense of dignity. Not like this overblown shepherd who thinks he knows how to be a king. I see Doug looking very carefully at me. And that questioning my exegesis here, but we're going to go on. She may also be thinking on some level, could I be that foolish? Could I have ever done anything like that? She might even be thinking, was I a fool to tell my father I wanted to marry this nutcase? Now, some background on this royal marriage of Michal and David. Michal had fallen in love with David back in the days of his giant fighting days. And her father Saul had offered her as a bride to David. But David couldn't afford the bride price. And Saul says, have I got a deal for you? You bring 100 Philistine foreskins to me and she's yours. Now, David is no slouch. He doubles the bride price. And he goes out and kills 200 Philistines. because that's the only way to collect the bride price. They don't want to let go of these things. So, and to think that there are people who say the Bible is boring. So the two are married. And when Saul grows jealous of David's increasing power and influences and sends men to kill him, Michal helps him to get away. After that, he doesn't see much of her. Seems a little ungrateful. And he marries Abigail and a couple of other women. And so the marriage of Michal and David has been kind of an on-again, off-again kind of marriage. And I think David dancing naked was kind of the last straw. I mean, there are women out in this congregation, I'm sure, that are sympathizing with Michal here. So what is the root problem or the root cause of Michal's problem with David? I think it's because all her life with David, she has been going by appearances. First, she sees David, the warrior poet. I mean, I have noticed that given a choice between a poet and a soldier or an athlete, women will invariably go for the poet, right? I've always envied poets that. And the fact that he's a warrior, so she's smitten by this poet warrior. And then she sees this powerful leader he becomes, destined for greatness. And then he's an inattentive husband. And now she sees this guy acting in a way that she feels is foolish. At no point has Michal seen the real David, the David upon whom the Spirit of God rests. And so David says a few verses after what was read this morning, "It was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father that I have danced." I have danced before the Lord. Who are you to question that I have danced before the Lord? He made me king over Israel. How often have you judged someone inappropriately because of appearances? You know, when I discovered that my youngest brother was homeless, and then we brought him up here, from that point on, I was unable to see a homeless person on the street without seeing my brother. And, you know, I cannot judge those people because of what I know of my brother's background. Now, I can only, instead of judging them, I can only say, what circumstances brought them to be where they are now? How many people, homeless or not, do not know that God has, in Paul's words, destined us for adoption as his children through Jesus Christ, according to the good pleasure of his will? How many people have turned away from that inheritance? They've been to church, perhaps, and had bad experience and said, this isn't for me. Or they're depressed and everything looks bleakly unreal. Or they judge only by appearances because hypocrisy, anger, hatred, and a variety of other human emotions are always on display in this world. Or are they simply fearful? They don't know where to look for help. Now Herod the second, the Herod of this story in the gospel, was the son of Herod the Great. That he's the one with the slaughter of the innocents when Jesus was born. Now, Herod Jr. was not as accomplished or powerful as his father had been. Nonetheless, he was a prince. He was the one who gave the orders. He was the one people looked up to. but there doesn't seem to have been anyone that he could turn to with his problems. Now, Herod's family was an interesting one. His father, Herod the Great, had married at least 9 wives, including a cousin and a niece. So it didn't seem unusual that Herod Jr. would want to marry his brother's wife. It was kind of a family thing. But this was contrary to Christian doctrine at the time, that held that a woman could remarry only after her husband's death. And John the Baptist has gone to Herod and said, this is wrong, this marriage. And he's made an enemy out of Herod's new wife, Herodias, who sees that if this is believed, it jeopardizes the marriage, puts it in a poor light. And so Herod is in a difficult position. On the one hand, although he fears John because he's a just and righteous man, but he also is drawn to the things that John says. And on the other hand, his wife wants to kill John the Baptist. So what does he do? Angry wife, righteous prophet. Righteous prophet, angry wife, what to do. And we know where this is heading. And then Herodias ups the ante just a bit, using her daughter, her dancing daughter. So the daughter is not named in Scripture. We know her name was Salome because from the contemporary Jewish historian Josephus, who actually names her. And a footnote here, in keeping with the family tradition, a few years after the beheading of John, Salome marries her uncle. Now, wouldn't this whole story make for great TV? I think Game of Thrones has got nothing on this. So Salome demands John's head on a platter, and Herod gives it to her. But did he have to do that? First, promising half the kingdom was hyperbole. First place, it wasn't his kingdom to promise. So that was an empty promise. It was a boast as much as anything else. And he could have said, I meant anything but that. Nobody would have criticized him, especially for standing up to a teenage daughter. I mean, how many parents have had to take a stand against a teenage daughter who was asking something unreasonable, present company accepted? I'm sure you never had to do anything like that. But Herod's a fearful man, and he's a weak man. He's afraid of his wife. He's afraid of the opinion of his guests. He's not acting like somebody in charge. He's passive. He's allowing the opinions of others to dictate to him what he should do. Herod was afraid of losing face, and because of that, he killed the man. He could not face the reality of who he was, and so he killed the man. Later, out of guilt, he believes that Jesus, that he's heard about, was John come back to life through some terrible spirit. And this is something that was not uncommonly believed at the time, but Herod is terrified by the notion that John is going to come back. A New Testament scholar once described the strange power of moral and religious truth to launch a civil war in the heart and mind of man. And that's what's happening to Herod. The murder of John the Baptist starkly delineates the fear that underlies his pretense as a prince of the Roman Empire. Have you ever fought such an inner battle? Not because you killed someone, I hope, but because, say, you disrespected someone. I mean, Jesus says that when you call a man a fool, it's as good as killing him. It's easy to condemn Herod, but he is just like us, arranging things so that we can't be blamed, so that life doesn't look awkward, but life is always awkward. We try to create a different reality, hiding behind the masks that I've talked about before. Is any one of us, like David, willing to dance, even to stand naked before God? Herod thought he was alone, that he had nobody to turn to. And so he made decisions based on feelings of others and his own passivity. Herod could no sooner stand naked before God than he could flap his arms and fly to the moon. And neither can us. Not the flying to the moon part, but the standing naked before God. None of us could do that on our own. We can only do that because Christ is the one we can turn to. Unlike Herod, we have someone to turn to. The very Christ that struck fear into the heart of Herod loves us and loved Herod. If only Herod had been capable of understanding the message of John the Baptist. Only if he had just been able to hear what John the Baptist was saying. Christ accepts us as we are, with all our inner conflicts. He tells us not to be afraid. Not to be afraid because we are like others. Because he sees us as we are. He sees past our masks. He sees past our ego. He sees past our armor. We're always naked before God. And that's okay. Because he loves us all equally. We are all equal before God. And we're loved by God. In the words of Paul, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace that he lavished on us. Amen.